Hey everybody. Sorry about the sun here. Quite a bit of contrast. Sorry about that. Hope it's not too difficult for you to see, or maybe at this point now we're pretty much done with how I look, and you're just listening. You've got a couple of different issues when you talk about that, and you look at a city that is probably one of the most multicultural cities in California. I'm going to guess is going to be Irvine. Irvine's got a um, majority Asian community, and that Asian community is broken down into people from several different countries, several different age groups. So you have recent I should say recent immigrants, but you have recent immigrants, I guess. But thinking you have older people that have come from a culture that they were well ingrained, a way of life they were well ingrained, and now they move to California, and they find it's a whole lot different here. The second issue that comes up is the next generation. So maybe it's a middle generation. May have been born outside of the United States, maybe were born in the United States, but have spent a vast majority of their life locally. And then you have the next generation, all probably Irvine residents for several years, and certainly California residents for a long time. And they are another group that is growing up in a two-culture family. I mean, basically, they have grandparents or parents that were really firmly entrenched in their culture, and now they're here, and the children are much more entrenched in a Western culture. So, that's an interesting thing, especially when the cops show up because Junior's gotten into some trouble, or maybe the parents were the victims of a crime, and they are having enough trust in the American system now to call the police. And then there's also a whole ton of business infrastructure in the city. The next thing that you look at are the other groups, and maybe on the same level as far as the different culture, the multi-generational families, a large Persian, Iranian group there, and that's a big distinction. Those that identify with the Persian culture, and those that identify with the Iranian culture, big differences, and a lot of clash. There's a large Afghan culture, and that Afghan group and the Persians, have only not gotten along for a millennium or two. So, some of that you still see in how people, get along. And then you talk about the new minority culture, which are Anglos, European-born or European ancestors, and so it provides a really interesting backdrop. You compare Irvine to, maybe a Santa Ana, or to a city that has a high immigrant culture, and that is, somewhat close to, the current culture, or I shouldn't say current culture, but a Western culture of northern, California Norte, I guess. So really interesting, issues going on there. We focus a lot on the African American culture, and all of the things that go along with that, and it's sometimes we forget those other issues. In the writing assignment, I'm kind of wading through that. And what I'm seeing is that a lot of people took the hint of Mendenhall and Bennett, and they stopped right there. They defined, took care of one part of the essay, and then they said, okay, he wants to hear about Mendenhall and Bennett. But remember, I said begin here, and it was hint hint, begin here. So there's all kinds of other issues in between. Ren is an important point. So if you wrote a really good paper, I mean, strong grammatically, you didn't have any issues there. One that I'm seeing over and over and over as far as grammar goes is capitalization, and that's a minor grammar point. Everybody should be well beyond that by now, and we're having a lot of trouble with that. So what I wanted to see in the essay as far as content goes, was the discussion of racial profiling and the idea of profiling, period, and hoping that some people would start to see that racial profiling has become a catchphrase, and that it's sometimes difficult to define, even more difficult than just going to the ACLU webpage or NIJ's webpage. It's a little bit more difficult to define than that, but the other issue that comes up is it's next to impossible to prove. And the problem is you look at Mendenhall, Mendenhall was a 1980s case, and as students and as people in their 20s, you go, God, how that's ancient history. Well, it's so funny because we treat Mendenhall like it happened last week when I read your papers. And Mendenhall was 30 years ago. And one of the questions that I have, and I haven't seen anybody posit this yet, as to whether or not Mendenhall would be argued by the attorneys and the court and decided the same way by the court today. Would there be much more discussion about Mendenhall's race? That was only kind of a minor point in the opinion. Then we get to Bennett. I sure would like to know what prompted the lieutenant, now the chief, to write that memo. It's not like, it's 1995, so that's, still 23 years ago. But what prompted him to do that? By 1995, I'd been in law enforcement for, excuse me, law enforcement for a while. And by 1995, it was very well known that race was an issue, and that there had to be, you had to be solid legal ground when dealing with everybody, no matter who they were, whites, that. And if you were out hunting for some pretext, it better be a good pretext. So that's what I was looking for in that. And I'm not really finding a lot of it yet, but I'm probably halfway through the papers, so maybe I'll get it. Let's talk about community policing. And what I have to do here is, just occurred to me, I made some notes, so I got to pull those up really quick. Community policing, when it first came around, it started with the broken windows theory, Packer of, or the two types of, legal basis, the crime control model and the due process model. It's kind of started there, and then it went to, then there was a large discussion about the idea of broken windows, and we see broken windows, come back into play or come into play. The idea of I think it was a Stanford professor that to prove broken windows on a small scale, he parked a car out in front of his office for a couple of weeks and just left it there. he went out to the car, and I think he like let the air out of one of the tires and let it sit there. And then pretty soon there was a broken window on it, and then somebody else let the air slash the tire on the other side. And, started stealing stuff from the car. As long as the car was there and it was well kept, it wasn't the victim or the center of crime. However, then it later became the center of crime. So then you see, say, broken windows comes on, contagion theory, stuff that we will talk about in the chapter and you'll read about in the chapter. But then it started to hit law enforcement, and it became, were groups such as PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, big East Coast group, going into law enforcement, and you were wanting to be a student of the profession, take a look at PERF, Police Executive Research Forum. Really, really big, and it has quite a few contacts in the West Coast, and a lot of chief's jobs are decided by PERF people behind the scenes. And you have some big names in law enforcement that are involved in PERF. So that is something for you, say, as a student of the profession to be aware of, as far as a group that you might want to follow and see what they're doing. I think we'll talk about it. If we haven't already. We'll talk about PERF's stance on use of force. And I'll have to look back and see, and look forward and see. But that's a PERF's a model of use of force is gained quite a bit of discussion in police circles, in the street circles especially, because PERF is trying to change the way that agencies and investigators look at use of force issues. So all kind of comes from the same deal. A lot of the work on community policing came out of the academic realm. Harvard, Kennedy School of Government, University of Minnesota, where Packer is from. Packard's the car. Packer is a football player, and apparently the criminologist. So as we move on from there, one thing, we have that concept, and I see it in your papers, and I see it in all students' papers. Bring the community and the police closer together. Bring them together, and you'll solve so many of the problems. And I'm, okay, just as maybe a bit of a antagonist. I don't know if that's if bringing people and the police together helps. Because what happened when we did that the first time that we had the people and the police had a close, intimate relationship? Well, we ended up with large scale of corruption, of people that were doing things that were illegal and wanting to have special considerations by the police, and they did that through payments and corrupt activities. We're probably a little bit less exposed to that now because of the higher level of education with officers, the fact that policing is still looked at as a blue-collar profession, but it does have a little bit more status with a majority of people than it did before, did when in the days of the political era. So we got to look at the idea of is it working? Is community policing working? And we're going to talk about recruitment, and I don't know. You talk about recruitment and you're still using the same model to hire people in your recruiting and when you do your interview. That's an important part. That sets the tone for the kind of people that you're looking for. We'll talk about that the last week of the semester. How much does the community want to be involved? I was watching an old movie from the 90s with Robert Duvall called Colors. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen Colors. And Robert Duvall and Sean Penn are two cops working in southeast LA. and they're dealing with the gang culture there. There's a community meeting, and the members of the community want to know what the police are doing, and the police want to know what the community's doing, and it ends up in a big brawl and a yelling match. But there's some truth there, in that sometimes the police feel in a position that there's nothing that they can do, nothing that they can do that's going to be right. That they're in that proverbial catch-22. So as we look at community policing, and then we talk about is going to be how to define community and the difficult aspects of it, because each community, each city or county is going to have multiple different communities. And it may be by ethnicity, it may be by interest. Orange County has a large car culture community. If you go to Cars and Coffee down in South County, in Aliso Viejo, on Saturday mornings, you're going to find hundreds of people there walking around looking at other people's cars, not buying cars, not driving cars. That's the car culture. So there's multiple different cultures, and as we work through community policing, we have to really identify what culture we're talking about. The other hand with community is community ownership, is how the upkeep of homes and businesses. Does it look like it's in a third world country, where there is no investment? Does it look well kept? Does the community look well kept? And you as a person drive through a well kept community, gauge what your fear factor is, what your fear level is. Those of you that are in or that you drive through a community that's disorganized, and gauge what your awareness is of your surroundings. Are you more aware? Are you looking for bad things, bad people, potential threats, danger? Now, with the community, let's talk about the other part of the equation, and that's the department. The first thing with the department is the entire organizational culture has to change. And I would suggest that that's an incredibly difficult thing to achieve a big change. Organizational momentum, meaning that the direction the organization was going, if it's moving this way and there's a force that's trying to pull it this way, you may slow down the organization, but it's going to take quite a bit of work. See if I run out of hands yet. Till you start to get that to move the organization, move towards a direction that you're going. Very difficult issue, very difficult thing to do. And sometimes agencies unknowingly just pay lip service to that, to community policing and putting the policing decisions in the hands of the public, allowing them to make those decisions. More often, it's an exploitation of the participation and the partnerships. Is there a way for us to gain ground on a partnership basis through more support, more donations to policing? And dare I say, I wonder if that is getting closer to the concept of corrupt conduct. And I don't know. I have no studies to do. I don't know if anybody's even studied that idea or that concept. But when you see an organization, giving money for canines or for other activities, look at what that business might be gaining from that. That should be a question that's in your mind. The next issue we've already talked about, but the idea of measures of productivity. How do we know the cops are doing anything at all? Some agencies, the union will exploit community policing to take away that concept of objective measures of performance. And the review process, becomes much more watered down, with who's doing a good job. And sometimes it comes down to the fact of who's getting fewer complaints. Because when you contact the public, it's a very rare officer that doesn't get complaints. There's also other officers that get a complaint walking Mother Teresa across an intersection just because they just don't mix. Well, with people. And very, very interesting concept. But for those of you that get into police management at some point in time, you're going to find that you're going to have some people that could sell an ice cube to an Eskimo. You have other people that, like I say, couldn't walk Mother Teresa across an intersection without getting a complaint from someone, somewhere. And there's always people that want to complain. Now, I remember a guy got run over on a bicycle, and it was on a major street. It was a Sunday morning. And it took me about 4 minutes from where I was to get to the scene. Well, from the time of the call till I got to the scene, guy had been pronounced, medics were there, pronounced him, sheet was over him, and we got a complaint from an ER doctor who said that the body was left to just sit out and nobody was. Well, it took 4 minutes to do that. The medics came, they put a tape on him. They saw that he didn't have a heart rate, or a heart could be, dealt with. The injuries were pretty significant, and you can tell that it wasn't good. And but this guy complained. Well, I thought 4 minutes was pretty heroic to get that and get that covered up. And he wasn't complaining about the sheet. He was complaining about the fact that there was an exposed dead person on the roadway. So, interesting issues of that. Next question with community policing from the skeptical side is, how do you manage calls for service? When the phone rings, people expect an officer to be at that door, and they expect them to be there in a time frame that they're going to talk about as reasonable. It could be 2 or 3 minutes. I think the average emergency response from the time that the call comes into dispatch until the time an officer arrives, and an emergency call is like 9 minutes. You try doing CPR on somebody for 9 minutes, that's a long, long, long time. When you're, say, right in the middle of a priority E situation, as a civilian especially, where you're not trained, you're not exposed to this, you don't have the ability to put the stress level aside to complete your task and your mission. So then we talk about other issues you'll see are the management philosophy. And initially the management philosophy was to flatten the organization. So, you had this, and we talked about it earlier, about these management structures. And you had a chief, you'd have maybe deputy chiefs, you'd have potentially captains, lieutenants. Lieutenants would do a yeoman's amount of work in the management level. And then supervisors, sergeants, corporals that had supervisory responsibility, and then line level people. Well, with community policing, the idea was to flatten that organization, bring the line level closer to the upper management, so there could be communication between the two. Going to get in trouble with my peers on this one, but I would propose that many managers don't want to have that level of communication. They like that insulation. And you'll see some agencies that have flattened the organization, brought their command staff down to the level of maybe being having the responsibility for individual geographic portions of a city, mini police chief, perhaps. and then are now moving those managers back into a broader category of management philosophy on a more hierarchical structure to provide those levels of buffer from the line guys up through the organization. Um, very interesting thing. I know one very forward-thinking police department that I thought that is now doing that, moving back to that approach. Another idea that you see all the time in community policing is this concept of foot patrol, and how how that's a really necessary function for oh goodness, let me see what my time was. Foot patrol for necessary function for community policing and to make it work. Well, first off, you have to have the geography for it. Picture Irvine. Does it have a good geography for foot patrol? Well, they've used foot patrol at the Spectrum, or they did use, and that's been curtailed, has been brought back quite a bit. But at the Spectrum, Costa Mesa, foot patrol. You know, you can go into individual neighborhoods, into tract homes, and have a person walking around, you know, an officer walking around. You know, you're just not going to see that much, and it's not going to be effective. Maybe when you have large urban downtown settings, that their effectiveness in that small area might work well, but it's not efficient because you still got to answer the phone. You still got to handle calls for service. So an officer walking around downtown gets a call, has to walk or run back to their vehicle, get in their car, and then drive to a location. It increases that level of response time, which we've discussed before. The public is not excited about giving up response time to have an officer on foot in a particular beat. So foot patrols are a pretty interesting thing that you really have to staff for, and you have buy-in from the community regarding that foot patrol. Car patrol, patrolling vehicles is here to stay. And not cars anymore, it's now these SUVs, since Ford's no longer making the venerable Ford police package. When you talk about community policing, the next thing you have to talk about is problem-oriented policing. And what that means is that the police, or hopefully the community, will identify a problem, and then the police will go out and come up with a methodology to solve that. And that's a reactive approach. The proactive approach on that is through things such as CEPTED, community policing through environmental design. Really important aspect to look at. But you have to do that to be really effective from the ground up. You can't come back later and change a community. Imagine going into areas of LA County that are considered bad areas and upgrading the sight lines, the lighting, the roadways, cul-de-sacs, the creek beds, the parking lots. You know, imagine the cost and how much foresight you'd have to have there, as opposed to when you build, you know, the city in their permitting process has these ideas already in mind. CEPTED's a really important issue, but it's also a really difficult one to work through. Reactive, this is that idea of Sarah. And I'll tell you, you know, Sarah was really big, you know, in the early 1990s, middle 1990s. And there was forms that people made, and you had to fill out these forms, and, you know, your Sarah form, and you had to give it to a supervisor to read it and make suggestions and approve it. Agencies just don't do that anymore. They say officers go out and they take 4 211s, 4 robberies, of liquor stores in a small area. Well, now they're going to go, okay, we got a problem. What are we going to do about it? Well, in advanced agencies, they'll go to crime analysis, have crime analysis first pull the data for that particular crime, that particular area, and then maybe other crimes. Whether kind of arrests that are occurring in that area. And then crime analysis and the officer and maybe an advanced agency, an investigator will come down and they will sit down and try to analyze what the problem is. Why are we having that particular problem? Or are they going to say, okay, is it a septet problem? Is it an area where you have liquor stores that are poorly lighted? Lots of back alleys, so that a bad guy can come out, run out, get into a car, and then drive away down a back alley and not be on a major street, for more than a second or two as they exit a building. Are these alleys lit? Is there camera capabilities available to catch somebody once they flee, capture a license plate? Which brings up a whole other set of issues when you talk about privacy. So, crime analysis becomes a huge part of this. And crime analysis will also push officers into something that they don't like to do, and that's to revisit a problem and assess it. Were we successful, and how were we successful? Did we take and move this 211, this armed robbery series, from our city and displace it into another city? Well, I'll tell you, for the city that no longer has a problem, that's a perfectly good answer. Displacement. Get it out of there. So when you look at community policing, I think the last thing you should look at are the barriers. And everybody's got a part of the barriers. The community does. Their expectations of police. One of the problems with community policing is the police are now being called on to solve more and more problems. More and more issues that people took care of themselves now become the purview of the police. Johnny won't do his homework. I had calls like that coming against my child. My child won't listen to me. And you get there and the kid's 9. Okay, you got some parenting issues that we have here. My neighbors, it's got we've got an officer in San Diego killed several years ago. My neighbor's roses are in my property. He's on the wrong property line. And the officer goes out. One of the neighbors is so incensed by this, goes out and shoots the officer and kills him. It's insane. But more and more problems that people could usually normally solve themselves, they now look to the police. Their level of incapacitation when bad things happen skyrockets. They don't have the ability to react and make any kind of a decision, let alone a good decision. The next issue that you have are managers. Do managers want to go back to a filtered group so they're not having to deal with all of these particular issues? One problem when you have command staff that's in charge of geographic areas, complaints will often go directly to the top of that chain. They don't have to deal with it. And commanders don't like that. That's not what they want to be doing. And they'll push them back down. But if they're in that filtered area, they have a whole other level of managers to deal with those problems. So, another incredibly long video. Sorry about that. But a lot of musings on community policing. And this week, I'm trying to remember what the assignment is. It's got to be a discussion board. And I'm checking right now. And what do we got? Of course, the computer. Oh, there we go. And it's going to go one more level. Okay, and it's going to talk about the agency problems and then also the community problems in community policing. So think a little bit deeper. The idea of community policing good, got to be community policing, community policing. Think about what the problems are. Why community policing isn't solving problems like Ferguson. Is it because the officers are all bad people? Well, DOJ has tried to paint that picture, but I really don't think that's the case. Is it organizational culture? Yeah, could be. Is it lack of community acceptance? Could be. A lot of different things to think about. So try to put a little more thought into it. And after that, I think that should take care of it. I'll see you guys all in class.